So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Forrest Solutions webinar series. I am Deanna Bernard, Vice President, Staffing Sales at Forrest Solutions. Please note, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel for future reference. Thank you for joining today's session on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, a topic we believe to be one of the most important topics of our time. Many organizations believe that there is a lack of diverse candidates in the market. The panelists today will discuss how to overcome this issue, possible passive outreach, different tools to find candidates, how to have a welcoming job description, and an inclusive interview process. DEI aspects include, but are not limited to, culture, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, age, socioeconomic status, national origin, language, sexual orientation, and disability. For today's webinar, our speakers are Anna-Lesa Calvert, Adam Guttell, Vijay, Pendakur, James White. Anna is the Manager of Professional Development and Diversity at Hodgson Russ, a law firm. Adam is an attorney and partner at Jackson Lewis, specializing in employment law. Vijay is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Zynga, the gaming company. James is the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Lord Abbett, an investment management company. Forrest Solutions has addressed staffing and recruiting needs throughout the country for over 46 years. And in this challenging time of COVID-19, we are an asset for any organization as you prepare for the safety, security, and wellness of your employees upon re-entry to your offices. We offer wellness ambassadors, mobile associates, virtual workforce, as well as traditional staffing and recruitment. Additionally, we increase proficiency with outsourced office service solutions. Although we're based in New York City, we are national in reach. Let's start off with Anna. Anna, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Anna-Lesa Calvert. I am located in Buffalo, New York. As was mentioned, I am the Professional Development and Diversity Manager for Hodgson Russ, which is one of the larger law firms in the Western New York area. A little bit of my background, I came to Hodgson Russ after working 12 years in a nonprofit where our objectives were to ensure that underserved youth across our community were able to have access to sport and the life skills it built. I think that that experience really directs my work at the law firm around diversity and inclusion, particularly because a lot of the young people we worked with came from a lot of different backgrounds, culturally, socioeconomically, racially. All of the diversity pieces were a constant conversation that we were having both within our staff and across our organization. So those skills are transitioning sort of into a law firm, and it's kind of exciting and a good challenge to figure out how to take those skills and take diversity and inclusion into a law firm setting. So it's a little about me.
Thank you, Anna. Adam, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you to Forrest Solutions for inviting me to this panel. And I'm pretty honored to be here with the three experts on the panel who are real experts in diversity and inclusion. I'm primarily an employment litigator. I represent companies of every size in proactively addressing potential litigation and trying to avoid litigation, but primarily defending companies against litigation from in an employment context, discrimination, harassment, retaliation, those types of cases. And obviously there are a lot of pitfalls, a lot of problems that can happen if you're not cognizant of your diversity recruiting, or if you're doing it the wrong way. And that's where I tend to get involved.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then Vijay, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to join this group of panelists and some of the team from Forrest Solutions to have a great discussion this afternoon. And so thank you for including me. My name is Vijay Pendakur. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Zynga, as Deanna said earlier. I just started the role about 6 months ago, and prior to my job at Zynga, I was in higher education for almost 20 years doing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy work at universities across the United States. And so this is a little bit of a sector pivot for me, but there's a huge overlap in the skill sets and the knowledge bases that drive the work. And it's an exciting new set of challenges and puzzles to solve as well, being in tech. And so I look forward to a robust discussion today and being able to bring some of my lived experience of this work to bear on what we talk about.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Vijay. Okay, and then James, would you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's great to be here. And thank you to Forrest Solutions for, sort of creating this time for us to come together. So again, I'm James White. I'm the head of diversity and inclusion at Lord Abbett. We are a 90-year-old company, and in late 2018, our managing partner decided that we need to hire a head of diversity. So I'm proud to say I'm the first in this role. And this is the second time, actually. My previous company, I was also the first in that role. So one of the things I've learned about myself is I do like to build things. So building a strategy from scratch, building a function from scratch, getting buy-in from senior leadership and engagement of all the employees, and then translating all that passion into sort of actionable goals so that we can achieve progress is a real passion of mine. So it's been a great just over 2 years since I've been with your organization. We've already achieved a lot in a couple of years. So we were just recently recognized in Pension and Investments Best Places to Work. We also just scored 100% on the Corporate Equality Index. And I just have to mention this one time because it's one of the things I'm really excited about. But 2 years ago, as we entered Pride Month, our building is in New York City, or is in New Jersey, facing the New York City World Financial Center, right on the water. And we had the great idea of lighting the building because we wanted to go really bold as we're going into this journey. And we had the idea of lighting the front facade on the Jersey City waterfront in the colors of the rainbow flag. So please do go look at Instagram page, Lord Abbett Instagram page. You'll see pictures of the building lit up. It's pretty cool, and it's been a great, opportunity to be involved with a firm who's been so willing to be bold in their work. So thank you again. It's great to be here.
Well, perfect. Thank you all for your introductions, and thank you for joining the panel. Let's start with the first question that I have, and that is, what is diversity hiring? James, I'm going to go to you first. Would you mind telling me what you define diversity hiring as?
Yeah, so most of these firms and all of us, and we hope all of your firms have goals set for yourself. We understand we're going to talk today about some ways in which I'm sure that you can, talk about some of these aspirational goals in a positive way, and some ways that can get you in trouble from an employment law perspective. But our firm actually has 5-year aspirational diversity inclusion goals, and so the way in which we're going to meet our goals is to start to draw a line in the sand. And so diversity recruiting is really the practice of change management, of how you're going to go out, find that talent, often looking in talent pools where you have to be a little more creative, but finding that talent and then really working through the biases in the assessment process to make sure that that talent, that underrepresented talent, is able to work through, remain through the assessment process, where we can, as much as possible, eliminate that bias. And then bring them straight into the door. So that's my view of when I think about diversity recruiting, it really is that solution, that creative solution, for, that disruption for how we're going to increase the representation of that diverse talent in our organization.
Thank you so much for that, James. I'm going to also go to Anna. I mean, one of the things I like about our panel is that you guys all come from different industries. You have different size organizations and different reach. Some of you are global, some of you are local, regionally, some of you are national. So Anna, what's your definition of diversity hiring?
I think when I think about diversity hiring for our area, it's a lot about considering how we're able to best serve our community. Mm-hmm. Buffalo is a very diverse community. We receive the second largest influx of refugees every year next to New York City. So the community is changing constantly. And we need to be able to do two things. One, ensure that we're hiring in a way that's thoughtful for the long-term success of our community. People love Buffalo. I'm not from Buffalo initially. I'm from Dallas, Texas. People like Dallas, Texas. People love Buffalo. And so if we're going to commit to our community in that way, part of it is understanding how as a law firm, hiring processes can continue to develop the community. In addition to that, I was talking to one of our newest associates who just graduated from law school and passed the bar. So we call him a brand new baby lawyer. And he is Muslim, and he was saying a lot of the community is now Muslim. If we are not, as a firm, bringing in people who can understand those cultures and those different cultural practices, then we're not able to serve the community in that way. So I look at our diversity hiring practices as both, sort of the business piece, which is very important, and I'm more of the people person and less of the business person, but it benefits both sides. It benefits our community and the changes we can make there. It also allows us to serve our clients well. So thinking about sort of it as a holistic piece to the business is sort of how I look at that.
Perfect. Okay, so something I've heard throughout my career at various companies is, we can't find any diverse applicants. So want to understand why people feel there's a perception there. So Vijay, if you wouldn't mind answering that, why do you think people have that perception there aren't any diverse applicants out there?
Sure, I'll try and speak to that. That's a complex question. I did also want to add to what James and Anna-Lesa were sharing earlier about what is diversity hiring, and I love the tactics and the sort of humanity that they were both bringing into how we frame diversity hiring. I think one of the things I feel the need to do as a chief diversity officer in tech is to also reframe diversity hiring around a value proposition that can move it away from sort of the stigma and the divisiveness around diversity politics, right? And so, in tech, there really still is this idea that because of the founding of many of these companies in Silicon Valley, that in order to be meritocratic, we shouldn't think about identity at all. And that's what tech meritocracy was all about. It was just going to be the smartest people in the room, and you come in, you build these apps, and you sell the products, and it's going to be great. And we've got 30 years of data to show that this didn't lead to teams that reflected the diversity of our world or the diversity of the people who are using these products. So there's oftentimes a design gap between people who are building technological solutions for various communities and the communities they're intending to serve. And so for me, there's the strategy and the tactics. And I think James and Anna-Lesa did a great job of speaking to that. And I think, even sort of one level up from that is constantly clarifying for people that at its core, diversity hiring is every company's mission to have their company actually reflect the diversity of the people they're trying to serve. And when you have a huge gap is when you get these foot and mouth moments where people develop a product and it fails, or people run an ad campaign and it ends up offending when they weren't meaning to offend. And oftentimes that's just because you're trying to reach audiences that you don't know anything about. And so I think it's so important for all of us. And if you're logged into this webinar, we're probably speaking to the choir, right? We all care about this issue, and constantly clarifying the value proposition, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do. Now to actually answer the question that Deanna asked me.
Please, that's fine.
This question or this refrain that there is a pipeline issue is both a reality and a smokescreen, in my opinion. And so, and you'll hear me do this throughout the session, right? Because in the DEI space, there's hardly any clear-cut yes, no, you know what I mean? There's yes and no. And so my yes to this refrain is particularly in my industry, so I'll speak to tech, right? We do have a pipeline issue. And it's very easy to see this if you look at the number of people getting computer science degrees. People might be surprised to know that the percentage of women getting computer science degrees of total computer science degree holders in the United States peaked in the mid-1980s. And we've actually graduated fewer and fewer by percentage women with computer science degrees since 1984. And so this idea that, time will give us progress is not true. Women currently are getting 20% or less of computer science degrees in the United States. And then if you look at OECD countries across the world, they're getting about 18% or less of computer science degrees. And I know that there's a lot of ways into tech that don't involve a computer science degree or a computer engineering degree. You can be an artist in UI UX, and you can be a business person in product management. But it's a canary in the coal mine, right? For the fact that there is a pipeline issue and there are equity and inclusion challenges upstream of industry, of all of our industries, right? That have to be dealt with if we're going to expand the pipeline and be in a place where when we're meeting with our recruiters and our sourcers, it's not this conversation where everybody's stressed out, like, I know you want me to increase, diversity yield, but there's just nobody out there, and that's a very real thing that I want to sort of humanize and name. My no to this, though, is that the refrain that there's nobody out there is a lazy way to let organizations off the hook who frankly haven't done the homework and the hard work yet. So if your sourcing strategy is not equitably designed and aggressive and in non-traditional spaces, and if your talent acquisition funnel is not fully mitigated for bias, then don't tell me about the pipeline yet, right? Because that's a cop-out. And I think that many industries have used the cop-out to not have to deal with things that, I know, James, you were pointing this out, right? Like where are you going to find the talent? And there's a lot of tactics that are still unrealized, but we still hear the refrain over and over again of the pipeline. So it's a both and that I would speak to. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's okay. That's fine. I do have to ask you one question. You mentioned something, OECD. Would you educate me? What does that mean?
That's just it's a consortium of more economically developed countries. So I think there's going to be an economist on the line here who can give a better answer to this question. So let me butcher it totally, and then maybe somebody can write into the chat. But it's like 36 or 37 countries that are part of various agreements and consortia, but it's oftentimes an index of what's happening in the more economically developed countries, and so. Okay. They also do some data sharing. That's how we're able to get the percentage of computer science degrees being awarded to women across OECD countries, because consortia have that commitment to data transparency.
Perfect. Thank you. You touched on bias, but before we jump into bias, I'm going to ask Adam a question. Before we go too deep into diversity and hiring tactics, what are some of the legal pitfalls that can happen when a company goes to, from the goodness of their heart, and what they want to do is to find more diversity candidates, but what are some of the things that they should be aware of when they're going out there trying to do this from a legal perspective?
Sure. I mean, there are, I think there's two ways to look at it. There's the goodness of your heart, and then there's, some sort of leadership directive that says, oh, let's, this may or may not be a problem. Let's throw something at it. We'll hire someone in a diversity position, but we don't really care about it. And let's get it done. Both of those, I think, are fraught with potential problems. Which is why I think it actually starts at the top, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But like Vijay was saying, the right way to do this is to get the pipeline, is to understand, to be creative, to understand where you're going to be recruiting from. It's not just saying in a very sort of superficial way, oh, let's look at it like a quota, right? That's the problem. When you do that, you're inevitably going to be in trouble. I've had cases where companies, and I don't, ascribe anything to their motives, whether it's well-meaning or not, took the wrong approach. Mm-hmm. And in places like New York City, for example, that's really dangerous, because if you said, okay, I'm looking for a diverse candidate to fill this position, and therefore I'm excluding people who I perceive now as not diverse, it doesn't matter. You're still making discriminatory decisions, right? And that's going to raise a potential cause of action for the candidate that doesn't get the position, or the someone who's already with the company who wants to advance. I mean, I've had that exact case because, for example, New York City, the standard is being treated less well than someone else. We do training, right, for anti-discrimination, anti-harassment training. And one of the first questions we ask is, everyone in the room, I mean, this 5 years ago, you would get weird answers with this question. Now everyone pretty much knows it, but it's, how many people think they're in a protected category? And, some people raise their hands somewhat. Everybody has a race, gender, national origin, religion or no religion, depending upon where you are is how expansive those protected categories can be. New York City, California, those are places that have pretty broad lists of protected categories. So if you're a company and you're making a decision in New York City saying, oh, we have this open position and it's our goal to fill it with someone of a certain protected category, that means you're necessarily excluding people of another protected category. And so you can't do it that way. What you have to do is you have to change your recruiting strategy. You have to expand the reach. And I'm sure, some of the experts on the panel can talk about the really sort of systemic ways to do that in the right way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Adam. Okay, so Vijay touched on bias. I want to talk about unconscious bias. That seems to be a word that's out there. I think people have different definitions for that. So James, would you please give me your definition of what you believe to be unconscious bias, what it means?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, this is a really complex topic, and it's hard to. We're not going to do any kind of justice in like a multi-day discussion, but the idea there is that you have a certain view of looking at people. I'm going to oversimplify just for a second. You have a view of looking at people who are not like you, and sort of like lessening your view of their skill set or the value that they could bring, mostly because they're not like you. People who are familiar to us. And maybe look like us, sometimes we will actually elevate their skill sets. Mm-hmm. And so what we end up doing is working against our goals. And what we're trying to really do is we can't change the bias. There's no way to unwire human beings. But one of the things I do believe, and there's so much talk out there about this around people debating these opinions, but I do think that you can raise awareness of it, not total awareness of it, but you can engineer situations where you become more aware of it. Sometimes before I bring our leadership team into a annual talent assessment, we'll have a conversation about bias and the way it shows up in assessing talent. And what that does is kind of sets the table. It raises to people's awareness in that moment so that they can be a little more aware of it. And then I remain on during the talent conversations so that I can challenge those biases. For example, whenever somebody says they're not a good fit, well, my question is going to be, well, tell us about what that means. Describe that to me. And so when we think about bias, we think about raising awareness of it at all of those situations where decisions are being made about talent, from hiring to compensation, to promotion, to mentoring assignments, to assigning plum projects, all of those decisions. And we think about how can we actually then, we know we can't get rid of the bias, but we know that we can actually raise awareness of it so that people are aware of it, and we can work to try to mitigate that at every decision.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to what James said? Go ahead, Adam.
I'm gonna make an analogy here, and please jump all over me if this doesn't work. But I've been dying to say this because, and my apologies to people who are big fans of the royal family. But I watched that interview the other night, and I watched, like in a tepid way. I was like, oh, nothing else is on. I'm watching it, and all of a sudden I was like fascinated by it, because if you take if you stop for a moment and you listen to what was being said, I understand there's a dispute. Some people say things happened, didn't happen. I'm putting that aside. Assume for the moment that, like in a lawsuit, the person who's making the allegations, assume for all purposes that those allegations are accurate. You've got someone talking about an organization, right? Mm-hmm. And an organization where there was a real complaint. I mean, what really, let my antenna go up on this was she actually said, I went to HR. Right, at one point during this interview. And I said, oh, really? This is a real big organization. And there was a problem. And clearly there was an indifference. Again, if you take them at their word, there was an indifference at the top, right? Not that the people at the top were necessarily harboring some systemic racial views, but enough that they were indifferent to those views as they're, come down the line. And unless you have a change at the top, I'm not saying you throw out leadership at organizations, but leadership has to be cognizant to these things. And so, I know they ran around the next day saying, no, it wasn't the Queen. The Queen was not the person who said this terrible thing. But it starts at the top, right? And if the top ignores these things, it becomes a problem. And I just read today, the Queen finally issued like a public statement, and it read like a corporate statement, which was, as to the allegations of race, we are investigating, or something along those lines, right? So, the point is that I think the perception is with an organization like the British royal family, for years and years and years, you could say, oh, that's just the way they are. Companies can't get away with that. And I don't think they can either, because they're essentially run like a company, the way, if you listen to those descriptions. So it does stop at the top. If you are the person running the organization, owning the organization, and even being indifferent to these problems, and that problem extends to diversity recruiting, you're going to have a problem all the way down the line.
It does start at the top. And I was going to tie in what you were saying about unconscious bias, what everyone was saying here with that. I was just reading an article the other day, and it was, it's coming that time of year when a lot of organizations are going to have interns. And a lot of them have what they call unpaid interns, depending if that state or municipality allows for that. And one of the commenters were like, well, that shuts out a whole group of people from being unpaid interns because they may not have the means to work for free. So how are you opening up your talent pool if you are, which I'm sure they weren't doing consciously sectioning off a group of people. So that's, I think to me, is one of those ways that unconscious bias comes in. Like we've always done that, to go back to what Adam was saying, not being aware of how, even though the best of their intentions is being received by other folks, but also understanding how possibly they can be cutting off their applicant pool. Does anyone have anything else that you can give along those lines, or anything you want to talk about in that area before I go on to my next question?
So I just wanted to jump in. We just did our recruiting training. So in a law firm, you'll hire summer associates. So they're a couple of years into law school. They're looking for a summer job. It's a paid job, but a lot of different people at the firm will do those interviews. And in preparation for that, you know, we talk a lot about culture fit, right? And this idea of, you know, the firm has been talking about, like, I don't care if he wants to get a beer with you. That's culture fit, right? Like, and so the example I gave to them was, you know, if you struggled in college your freshman year, but then got it together and got to law school, and this person you're interviewing says the same thing, they fit to you. They make sense in your mind. You can kind of wrap your head around that. What we are trying to, and had this conversation about with the recruiting group, is thinking about it as cultural add. So what's missing at the firm that we want to bring in, that a new associate can bring in? That could be a million different things. It's all about perspective, right? And an example of that could be, you know, we're based in Buffalo. We hire a lot of attorneys from the University of Buffalo. Mm-hmm. How do we get attorneys from different areas of the country? They have a different thought process. They've grown up in different ways. What do they bring to the firm? What are those pieces that someone can add as your organization needs? And I think that if you change that conversation from cultural fit to cultural add, and how they're fitting the values of the organization, you can move away from that. And I think that addresses the, they don't fit here. They don't, it just isn't the right person. Well, what do they add? And maybe they don't add something, or maybe you realize in the conversation that they're really aggressive and we're not a super aggressive group. So we need somebody who maybe doesn't fit that. They don't add to our culture. And I think when you can change that conversation a little bit, you can at least check your bias, right? Like, these are the things that make us who we are and who we want to be as an organization. This is what we're checking back against. And I think that, yeah, you can't stop unconscious bias, but there are ways to check it. And you gave an example of that right before a review process. Go through some of those trainings. There's research that says each time you are thinking about your bias, it at least pauses your brain long enough to check itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I find myself doing that all the time, right? Like, it doesn't make you good or bad. Everyone has these unconscious biases, but to be able to stop your brain and make it think, why do I think that? That enough can change the conversation and can change the way you're treating or thinking about someone else. And I think that's a huge piece of that puzzle as you're recruiting and retaining, you know, people at your organizations, is all of those pieces have to come together. You have to check yourself, and you have to figure out if they fit with your organization, not if they fit with who you are as a person.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that point you just made, Anna. Vijay, I see that you are shaking your head. I also want to, if you can, I know you want to add on to what she has to say, but also, can you talk about, you don't? Okay, well, then I'm asking you a question. Can you talk about some of the things that people can look at when they look at the job descriptions in the whole to encompass all of DEI, what to be aware of, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, sure. A couple of different thoughts here, and by no means do I claim to have extraordinary depth in the recruiting function. And so I would love to hear also from my other panelists, and I bet people in the audience can even type into the chat great things that they've learned along the way. But a few things that come to top of mind for me when it comes to job descriptions and the ways in which we can try and signal for inclusion, and also address the known research on bias and sort of different patterns of behavior in the candidate space. So one, there was a way of writing job descriptions for a very long time that was basically like, we're amazing, and here's 25 barriers to getting to become one of us. And if you can somehow surmount all of those barriers, then you can come into the cool kids club, right? And that was like, you know, the design logic of a job description for decades. It was a fence in many ways. And what I think in general, a big shift that might not seem like a DEI strategy, but it is to shift the thinking from fence to red carpet. How do you actually roll out a red carpet to anyone who's considering working at your company so that the job description is extraordinarily candidate savvy and extraordinarily warm and invitational? Rather than focusing on all the barriers, focus on the opportunity. What is the opportunity that this person has to add to your company, add to that project team, add to your product? And this way of framing things fits really well into the generational research around millennials and Gen Z and what they're looking for in employers. And the reason that functions as a DEI maneuver is because the younger generations are demographically far more diverse than the older generations. So using the baby boomer fence model might appeal to an older candidate base that is just empirically less diverse. And when you're looking to migrate into cultural ways of communication that speak to younger generations, you are also speaking to the more diverse generations. That's just the census data right there. And so, I think the red carpet, looking at every part of a job description and to see how you're using honey, how are we inviting people to want to be part of something by talking about what they can actually contribute. The second thing is to, when the hiring manager sends over their draft job description to HR and says, this is the job description I'd like to post. Oftentimes hiring managers will over err on mandatory requirements and have a short list of preferred. And I would encourage everybody to pressure test the mandatory requirements and to go through with a razor on every single mandatory requirement, because we oftentimes overload the mandatory. And what it does is, earlier we were talking about the need to look for talent in all sectors and to look in non-traditional spaces. Well, the more you have this 25-item mandatory list of things that you have to get this job, the less that your sourcers and your recruiters can be agile in the space and go after non-traditional talent. And so that's one reason, is in terms of your own agility and tactics in the space. But the other reason to really try and be very minimal around what one must have is because actually they've done good studies on this, is to look at the number of mandatory requirements versus what successful people have who do that job right now. We've overinflated the sense that you must have all these things. And if you think about this through a gender equity perspective, there's really good data that when women are looking at job descriptions, they think to themselves that they need to have somewhere between 90 and 100% of the requirements before they're willing to apply, right? And men are like somewhere around 50, 60, sometimes even 40%. And you're like, I think I see myself in about half that job description. I'll shoot my application in, right? So there's complex psychology tied up with sexism and male privilege that leads to this behavioral difference. But if your job descriptions are overloaded on mandatory requirements or even preferred requirements, you're in some ways moving unintentionally, unconsciously back to a fence and not a red carpet. And so I think that over and over again, I think that metaphor of fences and carpets, I think, is a useful way to try and look at your job description and ask these kinds of deductive questions around the ways that you're empowering your own agility in the sourcing space, and also keeping the aperture wide for the broadest part of your applicant pool to be able to see themselves in that job description and see themselves at your company. Yeah. That's not a comprehensive answer by any means, but I would love to hear from the fellow panelists on other things you think are valuable.
No, I was just thinking about the whole thing about how women do that, and I'm probably generalizing here, as opposed to a lot of guys just wing it and go for it. One of the areas, and we can definitely go back to that, but James, I wanted to ask you a question. One of the things that I do, I know whenever I go for a new job, is I go and I look at who the leadership is of that company. I go and look at their page to see who's on the board, to see if I see anyone who looks like me in that company. So for you, how can a company can you give some ideas about how they can change their culture or project their culture through their website, or some of the other tactics you may use when you're trying to attract a wider audience of candidates, of applicants for your positions?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, look, this relates so much to the last question. And I think that word signaling is just a really important word. You know, I've done a lot of work around looking at language that's very sort of gender specific. It feels very maleness in the choice of words. There's a whole school of thought too that speaks to how people in the US write job descriptions, and sometimes they sound like these like war-laden language, you know, about conquering and all these things. And people have said, you know, somebody said to me recently from France, we don't talk about war like that. We don't talk about the world in those terms. And when I read these US job descriptions, they seem very aggressive, and I don't know how to compete in that market because we don't think of the world in that way. We you know, our history with war is very different than yours. And there's also too just the whole LGBTQ. Look, when I read a job description, you know, I'm looking to see, is there a home for me there? And you read it, even though you may not be able to say that word or this home, it's a feeling. It's a feeling. So I think that word signaling is very important. Now, look, in some companies, when you look at the leadership team, you may not see yourself reflected in those people. But I think one of the things we have to do is to talk about things that we care about from our cultural perspective. You know, when we talk about, when you go to our Lord Abbett page and, you know, you see that building lit up, I mean, that's not just about the LGBTQ community. That is about a powerful message of inclusion for all communities in the world. And, you know, so you have to look at holistically how you look in the marketplace, just in terms of how you talk about the work you're doing, your values, your accomplishments, because, you know, look, like I said, our leadership, we may not be at that point where you see the leadership yourself in a reflection of the leadership. So you have to make sure as a company, you're really being clear about the language you're using in job descriptions, your values, what you're actually doing. Sometimes also just admitting that, you know, you still have work to do, but these are some things that we're celebrating and are proud of. So that word of signaling, I think, flows throughout everything a candidate sees. That idea of candidate experience is really important. So when I see that job description, when I look at the company website, what am I seeing? Sometimes it's very, very difficult for people on the inside to really get a clear perception of the experience of that candidate. So that's why we need to really get that feedback from people to say, talk to me about how you are, what you're seeing, what you're reading, what does the research say about some of those gender neutral words, that kind of thing.
No, thank you, James. And one of the attendees also mentioned, you mentioned war, using war wording. They talk about sports analogies, people using sports analogies in their job description and how they talk about the role and everything. I know I was at a company before and they're like, okay, if you, I'm in sales, if you get this, you get to go play golf. I don't play golf. Yeah. So I'll play tennis, I'll go skiing, I'll, you know, do other things, but get a spa day, but just being very intentional about your choice of words and where you go from there. Okay,
I also think, just really quick, to the website piece, make sure your website's up to date. Yeah. So we had a lot of things that we had featured that we had done. We have a high number of our partners are women, which is not as common in law firms. And I looked at our website, I was like, this is from 2010. They were like, yeah, I was like, that's like 100 years ago. Yeah. If you're a college student looking at it, they were like 12. So you need to be, you know, if you're continuing to do those things, take an hour once a year and make sure it's up to date, throw those things up there. And we got a lot of feedback at a recruiting event we were at recently. We loved your diversity page. Well, I spent a lot of time making sure that our information was up to date. You know, I'm at a cutout, 4 years or older, too long ago, right? And so we can archive that. It can be there for information, but the world moves so fast now that it has to stay up with the people that you're recruiting. And it looks like maybe you used to be into diversity and inclusion, but you're not really doing it now, which wasn't the case for us. So taking that time, you know, it's probably more than an hour, but taking that time to say, is my website up to date and reflecting what we're doing and believing in now? And I think that's especially important right now because people are very cognizant of those types of things too.
No,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Please.
I was just going to say, I think there's a certain level of sophistication now, though, that's, you know, people who grew up online, you know, and I'm dating myself a little bit, but, you know, when you see stock photos, to your point, when you see stock photos of multicultural people on a company's website, people know that those people do not work at that company. It's clear. People are sophisticated when it comes to authenticity. They really are.
Yeah, the stock photo thing, you can get in trouble real quick. Sorry, Adam, I cut you off.
No, it's all right. I mean, as long as we're on it, I got to put a pitch in for making sure your website's compliant, because I do think this feeds into the the whole discussion. I mean, if your website is so, old that you have stock photos, or you have, old pictures and old, you're probably not working with your website vendor to make sure that it's ADA compliant, which is a major issue. And unfortunately, we defend a lot of those lawsuits. And it does fit in. There are people with disabilities who are, visually impaired. And if they have, and not to drone on about this, but the way that works is they have devices that are auxiliary aids that will attach to their computers to allow them to access websites that will, convert text to speech and things like that. If your website is not coded appropriately, and it's a violation, and you can be sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act and whatever companion state and local law there is. So for litigation avoidance, you want to make sure that you don't have those problems, but also in terms of inclusivity, when you're recruiting people, there may be candidates out there who are in that category. And if they see your website is not compliant, there's no way they're going to want to work for your organization.
I was just going to add, because I think that Rafi had written in to say, can we also say something about grooming for success internally? And I know that this is an emphasis on this panel is about recruitment. But I worked in higher education for 20 years, and I would always say access without equity is a cruel joke. And what I mean by that is the reality that for first generation college students, only 50% of them complete a baccalaureate degree 6 years after starting. When you compound factors and you add Pell eligibility, low income status, when you add being a student of color, when you add being an adult learner, somebody with children of your own, the complete rates in higher education are sinful. And it's something that the industry is struggling with and needs to struggle with more quickly, frankly. But that's because, starting in the new millennia, there was this big access push without the attendant equity commitments, so that when you're admitting someone, you're actually admitting them into a space that is inclusive, a place where they can flourish and come to a meaningful sense of belonging, a place where they have the supports to be able to succeed when they're entering an institution or an organization that was historically not designed for them and actually exclusive to them, right? So move that whole metaphor from higher education into the corporate world. When we're talking about women in tech, when we're talking about people of color in any corporations in America outside of the service sector jobs, we are talking about environments that historically actively excluded these group members for hundreds of years. And so access without equity is still a cruel joke. And so internal mobility or career development, whatever you want to call it, is a necessary investment for any organization that's putting big bucks into diversity recruiting. Because what you'll start to see if you don't is you'll see a much higher attrition pattern amongst your underrepresented staff 18 to 24 months in. And there's industry-wide data that shows this over and over and over again, right? So 18 to 24 months in, more normatively represented group members are persisting, they're promoting, and underrepresented group members are attriting, they're cycling out because the environment is not a place where they can flourish, thrive, and come to a meaningful sense of belonging. And so I actually think that you have to braid together your internal mobility equity strategy with your recruitment strategy. Otherwise, from a sort of efficiency perspective, you're being inefficient because you're losing the talent more quickly that you spent all that energy in getting. But from a justice perspective, you're just not doing real equity work, right? You're not doing this well. And so I think that anybody leading on these diversity issues probably has to beat that drum all the time in their organization, because it's very sexy to go after recruitment. But the internal hard slog, day-to-day work of dealing with not inclusive environments, dealing with pay equity issues, dealing with managers who aren't skilled in managing diverse teams, dealing with benefits that don't support women through certain life stages, trans folks through certain medical needs they have. There's the labyrinth of inequities inside the workforce that are very difficult to tackle, but are a must. Otherwise, recruitment, that's the least of our problems.
Yeah, and I want to build on that too. I think I'm going to use a sports analogy, but we talk a lot about in athletics. I did some college coaching. We talked about finding the diamond in the rough, right? The student athlete who isn't going to, or is that not that high level, but is maybe a mid-major Division I athlete. I think about that too when we're recruiting. Those student athletes maybe were missing a piece, right? They weren't athletic enough or whatever. some of the students or some of the people that we're recruiting and bringing into our spaces don't have an understanding of what is required in a professional environment. So how are we taking the time to teach those skills in a way that doesn't kind of single someone out, right? But says, this is the way that you're sort of expected to work in this space so that you can be successful. And how are we supporting that conversation? And I think it's a great point to bring up too, that how are we supporting leadership to understand the back end of that too, right? So to say to someone, hey, and I'll give an example. We had someone who opened a door on a partner. He didn't knock first. Huge no-no, right, in our world. But when the door's open, you're always welcome to come in. That wasn't something that he just understood naturally. And there were some repercussions for that for him, right? So that's where I was able to step in and sort of talk to the partner and say, okay, these are the things this is your teachable moment. This is a young person who is, yes, he has a degree and all of that. That doesn't mean he came equipped with all of these skill sets that you just assume that he did. You need to take the time to sit down and have that conversation. More importantly, we went to his mentor and also had that conversation, because the mentor needs to give some more guidance on some of those expectations that other people at the firm are going to have. It's a constant training and teaching piece. And that's why I kind of like that, like my role is professional development and diversity, because they are so intertwined that if you leave one piece out, then you're missing things. And so it is our jobs to think about that from a complex way of, it can't just be, we got this great person and they're diverse, who for us, what happens after, and what resources and skills have you lined up on the front end to ensure their success in the long run? Or you're never going to look at the leadership thing and see someone who looks like you, because we never made the path for that. And that falls on the people whose jobs it is to do both of those things.
Okay, well, thank you. I agree with everything you guys have said. So I'm going to ask Adam, and I want James to chime in as well. One of the comments we had is, can we address whether having a college degree is required for the job? And that kind of goes back to what Vijay was saying before about, look at your mandatories. Are they necessary? I remember several years ago having a discussion with one of my peers, because he believed that everyone should have a college degree to become a salesperson. And I didn't think it was required for the type of sales we were doing. So we'd like to talk to you about how people can look at their hiring process, at their job descriptions from a legal aspect, as well as, James, if you could also add in from your perspective, from the corporate aspect as well.
Sure. Me first?
Yes, please.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll take first somewhat a cynical view on this, which is once you hire someone, and I think this goes back to what Anna-Lesa and Vijay was saying, is that, you don't want to just get someone in the door and then, let them flounder and see what happens. It's the same idea as, you don't want to get someone in the door for the sake of, looking good in terms of your diversity numbers. And now you've got an employee, not a candidate anymore. And I'll tell you from a litigation perspective that once you have an employee and there's an issue, you have a potential problem that could be bigger than a candidate problem. So you don't want to hire people that are not qualified for the job just for the sake of hiring people, right? Because when you then, we talk about this all the time, New York, for example, which is primarily where I practice, people say it's an at-will state. Oh, you can terminate anyone for any reason or no reason at all, as long as it's not unlawful, right? So when you do make a decision to terminate someone, if it's because they're not qualified for that job, you probably shouldn't have hired them in the first place. So I do think you have to, it's about not being lazy with your job descriptions and not being lazy about your qualifications that you're looking for. That being said, you don't want to be exclusive if it's not necessary. If your goal is to build on your base of employees and get the right people in and not exclude talent and look in areas where you traditionally have not looked before to benefit the company, absolutely. You should think long and hard about what's in that job description. But I wouldn't, sort of limit that job description for other purposes either, because once you get that person in the door and they're your employee, if they're not working out and you need to terminate them, it better be for legitimate non-discriminatory business reason. And this goes into diversity a lot too, which is, what is that reason? I get the call all the time from clients who say, well, this person is just not working out. Why? If you can't articulate to me why, if it's just, you just don't like that person, that there's some risk there. Why don't you like that person? If they're not doing their job well, if they have defined responsibilities and not meeting them, that's different. That's a legitimate non-discriminatory business reason. You put someone on a performance improvement plan, you work it through, and if they still are not, fulfilling expectations, then by all means, go ahead and terminate. And if they sue, it's a defensible matter. But I have real trouble with people who can't articulate the reason they want to eliminate someone from a position. And sometimes that is a cultural problem. They're just not fitting in. Well, what does that mean? Is that code for something else? Is that, and even unconsciously code for something else, which is a problem. So you have to be careful. And I think if you take anything away from this, it's don't be lazy in your recruiting. Don't be lazy in your hiring. Don't be lazy once you have people in the organization. You need to work with them.
Okay, thank you. James.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to those job description that, Vijay, you were talking about before, which is really allowing, when you talk about college degrees, I mean, I know so many people who are wildly successful that did not go to college. I know so many people who joined, and I made it a point because I really am looking for talent, and I'm looking for it everywhere. And I think sometimes it's hiding in plain sight. They themselves don't even recognize their leadership potential often. There have been twice in my career where someone in really looking at the talent landscape within the firm, someone caught my eye, and I realized, in their really junior role, that they didn't see that kind of future for themselves. It's a confidence issue. It's the message they've been sent all their lives. And, two of those people now are leading. I'm not going to mention names or companies because people know they are, but, two of these people now were had college degrees, but in the most junior roles of the firm, not necessarily in a leadership pipeline, and they're leading diversity functions at some very big tech companies right now. And so I think we really have to shake up that view. I think also when we look at, so many people are looking at higher education and starting to really, there's so much research out there where people are looking and really considering, is the college degree, is that what I need? Or maybe I create my own curriculum, self-guided curriculum. This idea that, curriculum is not one size fits all. I know that whenever I was in grade school, there was one curriculum, and I'm a very creative person. And I always struggled in grade school. When I got to college and was able to select courses and build my own curriculum, I absolutely thrived. But it was only when I could build a curriculum that was really aligned to the way I learn and the things that I'm good at. So when we're talking about college degrees, I am very passionate about the fact there are technical skills that you need, but we're missing out on a lot of talent often just because we're looking at that shingle on the wall.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you. So we have about less than 10 minutes left. This is the point where I go around and I ask everyone, I've gotten some things. I've been taking notes about clarify your value prop, cultural ad, access without equity, stock photos, website ADA compliant, and all of that. So I would like for each of you to give, for about 30 seconds, 45 seconds, give one takeaway that you would want to give to our audience, something that you've seen done somewhere else that might be helpful for them. Anna, I'm going to start you off and do the same order that we did the introduction. So Anna, you're first.
Great. Yeah, I think if I were to pick sort of one thing, it would be, I'm going to make it one and I'm going to meld it into two. But it would be to think about, really take the time and think about what your culture is and how someone adds to it. And then to make sure as you're considering those things, that you're looking at what are the other pieces that are needed in terms of training and in terms of ensuring that inclusion becomes a part of that. It's not enough to just add the person to your organization and move away from fit, but you really have to look at, is our culture matching our values in the way we want it to, and how can we ensure that it does?
Thank you. Adam, you're next.
Not to keep harping on this, but I think leadership buy-in is probably, just especially from the perspective where I sit when I'm most of the time dealing with the litigation and defending it, whether or not leadership had indifference to what was going on or had no idea what was going on, and you had some lower level person who engaged in misconduct, and now we're addressing it, right? That's you can't control, if you're in a giant organization, you can't control everyone, all the time, and there are mechanisms to deal with that, and those cases get resolved. But if the leadership isn't buying into the right way of handling things and diversity and inclusion, you're going to continue to have problems, even if it's just putting the patina of it on there. If they're not really bought into it, it can continue to be a problem. But if they do buy in, that's where you can really find solutions.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, Vijay, it's your turn, please.
If I was going to end with one thing for the folks that are logged in today and thinking about how to take action within their organization on diversity, equity, or inclusion issues, I would say follow the data. I think that so much of this work historically has happened through anecdote and passion. And the passion is great. We need that. It's not going to happen without the passion. But the really sophisticated practitioners who make change and sustain change in complex organizations do it using the data. And there's data on everything. So if you're in recruitment or if you are recruitment adjacent, look at your applicant tracking system and start looking at the ways in which you can pull data from your ATS and start to analyze, why is it that we seem to melt out or attrit women at a much greater proportion in this slice of our funnel? Or why is it that our pools, when we do a data scrape, tend to skew in this direction the minute we get to the director level or above in the positions? You can actually do this in a more empirical way rather than at the level of anecdote. Similarly, inside your company, when your company says, hey, we're going to do a inclusion survey, right? There's ways of doing this as a social scientist to actually look at the factors that matter and to then use data and weaponize data to create dashboards that hold business unit leaders accountable to saying, great, now we have data. I'm really excited to set some goals or OKRs with your unit as to what you're going to do in the next 6 months, because we're going to repulse this survey and see if your areas of opportunity have improved 6 months from now, right? That's the same way we would use data when it comes to the enterprise of making money. And there's no reason to not use data in the same way to drive progressive commitment towards equity and inclusion. So always go to the data.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And then James.
Yeah, I agree with that, the idea about data. It's so important. But I also, one of the things I've learned is that I thought if I put all of our hiring leaders through training, if I talked about culture, we got our leaders bought in, all the things we talked about today, I just thought when I first got into this work that if you build it, they will come. Talent's going to show up, and they'll work through the assessment process, they'll get hired. That does not work. So one of the things I really started to experiment with, and it's working these last few years, is really putting some more disruption within the process. So for example, before we start to interview for a given role, we started to put some measures in place to say we will not go forward with one candidate until we have X percentage of diversity in that initial slate. And then we will have a diversity candidate sponsor. It's a role, it's kind of are evolving as we speak. But the idea in there is they will be there through that process, challenging biases as the assessment process occurs. And there'll be that one point of kind of consistency. And then finally, as you get closer to those final decisions, putting some parameters in place to say, well, with our final four, if we don't have X% diversity in the final four, then we are going to back up. We're going to reassess the marketplace. We're going to be creative, and they're going to reapproach. And so I think, you have to, you can't just sit back and let that assessment just kind of take place and say, oh, well, we're still not finding the talent, all those other things come out. You have to be present in the process.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. What I heard today was intentionality. It is looking at and broadening your scope. I also heard is that once you get someone into the organization, what are you doing to be inclusive and making them feel at home and help them grow within the organization? So thank you, panelists, for being here. I appreciate it. Next month, April 13th, we're going to have another panel, which will be about DEI and culture within an organization. So the next take on this. Here is the listing of all of our contact information that we have here. Feel free to join us. Thank you so much. I am going to reach out to each of you. If you need to get the SHRM certification credit or the HRCI credit, I will be reaching out to all attendees to give them that as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time today. Hope you were able to take away some good points for your roles. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.